Hi everyone, I'm very happy to be here and to present to you some of the early results of our IBA project. So as Brian said, I'm Laura van Dijk. I'm a postdoc at the IBA project based at the Swedish Natural History Museum in Stockholm. So I would like to focus during my talk on these two questions. Where are the insects of Madagascar and what do they do? So, as you probably all know and also heard from the previous speakers, biodiversity is extremely important for the functioning of all of our ecosystems, because different species have different roles in the ecosystem, and together they make that the world functions as it does, basically. And a huge part of this biodiversity is made up of insects. And insects are not only the most diverse group, they are also a very important group, like Brian said so nicely, that they really glue the ecosystems together in terms of the functions that they do. So looking at insects is, a very important endeavor. And one way to measure biodiversity, as Brian also mentioned, is to look at biomass. So biomass is a relatively simple measure where you can just look at the weight of living things within a system. So in our case, we're interested in the insects, so we look at the weight of the insects that we collected in our samples. As you can imagine, this is quite a simple measure to get by, so it's also one of the first information that we received after we collected all the samples of the project. So knowing how much insect biomass we have and where that biomass exactly is very important, because insects are food to a huge diversity of organisms, like all different kinds of reptiles, amphibians, fish, mammals, birds, of course. Also insects themselves eat insects. That's why we set out to sample the insects around Madagascar, like Dimby explained to you. We had 32 different sites, 50 traps across Madagascar to sample the insects during a full year with sample collections every week. And in my project, we wanted to answer these two questions. When do we see most insects? Because you can imagine that the biomass of insects is not continuously distributed throughout the year, but rather it fluctuates. So the hypothesis is that, which has also been shown in some previous studies on smaller scales, that most insects are most active during the rainy season and less so during the dry season. So this was also our expectation for this project, but nobody has ever really looked at insect biomass distribution and on such a large scale, and especially not for the full insect faunas. And then the second question that we wanted to look into is, where can we find most insects? So do we see at certain locations in Madagascar, do we see more insects than in other locations? And why is that? Is that, for example, because there are different climates in the different locations? So moving on to the results. Indeed, we saw, as expected, that insect biomass was highest during the rainy season in Madagascar. So first, looking at this graph on the left side, you can see the week of the year on the x-axis and the biomass of insects on the y-axis. And the yellow dots are all the samples that we collected. And then in the black line, you can see the estimated total biomass through time. So indeed, in the beginning of the year and in the end of the year, biomass peaks, which is during the rainy season, whereas it drops in the middle of the year when it's the dry season. And on this right graph, you can basically see the same pattern, but then visualized on a map of Madagascar. So again, January, February, and also a little bit of March, there's high insect biomass, but then it drops when the dry season starts around April, May, and then it increases again towards December. So we saw this general pattern of more insects during the rainy season, but what we also wanted to know is whether these patterns of insect biomass through time were different among the different locations, and if so, why that was. So we looked at the temperature of different locations, and we saw that biomass changes through time were different when sites were warmer versus sites that were colder on average. So this is kind of a complicated graph, but I will just walk you through it. So here on the x-axis you can see again the time. So we start at the start of the sample collection till the end of the sample collection in August. And in the gray part you can see when the timing of the rainy season is. And then on the y-axis you can see insect biomass. And here you can see the color gradient, which varies from warm sites to cold sites. So warm sites are in yellow color and colder sites are in dark purple color. So looking at the trends among these sites, when you look at the warm sites, you see that they have higher insect biomass during the rainy season compared to the colder sites. However, when the rainy season ends, so when we go into the dry season, the biomass of the warm sites drops quite steeply and actually becomes lower than the biomass of cold sites during this dry season. And then we also saw different patterns of biomass for wet versus dry sites. So this is the same type of graph, but now the color gradient represents how wet a site is. So the bright yellow are wet sites and darker purple are dry sites. So when you look at the dry sites, they have especially low biomass during the dry seasons. But actually when it starts raining, these sites accumulate biomass very quickly and peak higher than the wet sites. So the wet sites actually have a much more stable biomass throughout the year compared to the drier sites, which are much more volatile in their changes in biomass through the year. So as I said, we also wanted to know whether we saw any differences between the location in terms of how much biomass there was. And here you see that projected on a map. So we just summed up all the samples that we collected for each trap and looked whether we saw any differences among them. So indeed we saw that there was a spatial pattern of differences in biomass. So some sites had higher biomass, so the brighter yellow colors than other sites. However, when we tried to explain this by looking at the climate at the different locations, we couldn't really see why these differences were between the locations. So biomass didn't really seem to consistently vary with the climate at those locations. So in the beginning I told you that insects are so important because they are food to many organisms, but of course insects have so many more functions than being a food source. Dimby already also told you a bit about them. So insects can be predators, so they eat on, for example, other insects, and in this way they keep insect pests in check. They decompose that plant and animal material, and therefore they are very important for the nutrient cycling. Some insects eat plants, so we call this herbivory. Insects can also be seed dispersers, or they predate on seeds. And of course, insects are very important pollinators. So in this map you can see the studies that have been done so far on ecosystem functions in the tropics. And I would just like to point out the knowledge gap that we have here. So in the circles you can see the bigger the circle, the more studies there are done. And the different colors represent the different ecosystem functions that were studied at those sites. So you can see that in South America there's a lot of studies done on all different kinds of ecosystem functions. Also quite a few in Asia, but in Africa there's very little studies done. Often they just focus on one ecosystem function, or actually they always only focus on one ecosystem function. And none of these studies are done in Madagascar. So it's really a unique data set that we have here with all the ecosystem functions throughout Madagascar. So just to remind you of the ecosystem functions that we did experiments on. We had the herbivory, so how much plant material was eaten by the insects at a certain location. We looked at predation for different types of prey, seed dispersal for different kinds of seeds, and also the decomposition by insects, as Dimby explained to you, insects as well as microbes with the lamina bait, and also microbial decomposition using this tea bag method. So I have only just started looking into this data, so I can only show you some of the preliminary patterns in space that we saw for these ecosystem functions. So here you can see all the functions that were measured, and you can see how the rates of these ecosystem functions vary in space. So the more yellow the color, the more of this ecosystem function is happening at a certain location. So I would just like to zoom into a few of these maps to show you some of the patterns. So for example, for herbivory, we saw that was mostly happening in the north. So plants growing in the north were on average eaten more by insects than plants further in the south. On the other hand, for predation, we saw a very different pattern. So this predation by insects actually mostly happened here in the west of Madagascar. So a next step is, of course, to try and explain why we see these different spatial patterns. And of course, a very logical explanation would be that these sites have different insect communities with different roles, which is why there are different functions happening at different locations. But also climate could play a role, or maybe even the interaction between the climate and the insect communities at a certain location. So to give you some take-home messages of my talk, you saw that insect biomass was highest during the rainy season, which was very much expected. But we also saw that this general pattern was dependent on the climate at a certain location. So we saw that warmer and drier sites fluctuated more in their biomass than cooler and wetter sites. And so these warmer and drier sites had more biomass during the rainy season, but much less biomass during the dry season. But then when we sum up the entire year, we didn't really see any consistent patterns with biomass differing among the different climates. And we also saw that the rate of ecosystem functions, such as herbivory or predation, they differed among regions. And as I mentioned, the next step is to link the biodiversity of insects to the climate at the locations and try and explain why we see these differences in ecosystem functions among Madagascar. So before I end my talk, I would like to specifically acknowledge the team of amazing field workers that have been collecting ecosystem function data across Madagascar. This was really an impressive effort. So this was done by Dimby, Thierry, Clavé, Jean-Jacques, and Chrysla. And with that, I would like to thank you, and I'm happy to take questions either now or later during the day.